Gabriel from Mandela Catalogue versus the Last Son of Alcatraz from Monument Mythos. God is a huge part of religion, but what happens when someone takes the place of God? That's where these two come in. The one that forced his position in replacing God versus the one that was forced to become God. These two are complete opposites but come from a similar idea, and that leaves the question of who truly deserves that title of God. Let's take a look at them individually and answer the question, who would win? Starting with Gabriel, Gabriel is a divine messenger, one of the angels that communicates between God and the humans, and is supposed to be a sign of triumph. But within the story of Mandela Catalogue, things change. Because Gabriel isn't a holy angel, or at least not this entity that pretends to be. He's something else entirely, a pure evil force, perhaps even the devil himself, and his only goal is to exact his will against humanity and gain power from that belief in God, and savors all of the suffering that humanity goes through. But Gabriel didn't brute force his way through this. He was an incredibly smart individual who knew exactly what he was doing every step of the way, starting by fooling Adam and Eve into eating the forbidden fruit, and his trickery kept going on for even longer, when he fooled the shepherds, and then eventually replaced God and used humanity's faith in it to make himself more powerful. And he has massive control over everything on Earth with his abilities. With him being able to manipulate the way you think to some degree, especially in the minds of humans, with him being able to manipulate them and control their fear, and being able to manipulate his own body to almost any degree he likes, being able to shapeshift to far more than just an archangel. He seems to be able to control light in a sense, practically draining it all from the area he's in, being able to manipulate sound and technology, and being able to kill someone without even touching them. And he seems to have vast knowledge of everything that goes on, almost like he's aware of everything that happens. And he's able to summon creatures called alternates. While they are nothing in comparison to him, they are still much stronger than any normal person, being able to easily manhandle normal people and even trained ones like police officers and take gunfire like they're nothing. With Gabriel seeming to be able to summon these things at any times he wants, usually making them to mimic another individual. But Gabriel, along with his alternates, have a special ability, with them being able to inflict a disease called metaphysical awareness disorder, or otherwise known as MAD. This is obtained when people are exposed to a forbidden knowledge that they don't want to be exposed to, which ends up driving a person mad and often leading to them ending their own life. But when it comes to Gabriel in particular, this is where things get a bit more interesting. Gabriel is obviously the strongest alternate, and is implied to have a lot of power. And while it is not fully known how strong Gabriel is, there is some context that allows us to get a decent idea. First of all, while it is unknown how long this process took, or how he did it, he was able to replace God, or at least deny him of any connection to our world. Now, there are differing views depending on the context of how you want to scale this, rather through him being more powerful than God or just manipulating his way to the top, but we can make a pretty good assumption by scaling him to the cosmology that is represented through the series, because it is outright stated that Gabriel exists on a completely different spectrum of reality, implying that Gabriel is at least fourth dimensional, and we can assume that he is probably one of the strongest beings from that dimension, if not the strongest, when comparing to God himself. And overall, while Gabriel is certainly a very interesting individual, little is fully known about him. But there is enough to understand that he is not here to be our savior. He wants our world and our doom. But is there some other being, one that can also replace God? Maybe a salvation, or maybe our doom? Let's take a look. The Last Son of Alcatraz didn't start out as the god of a man he would become. He actually was human, growing up like you and me, but after an accident and a dream that can only be described as one from the heavens, he was granted a gift, one that he could use to save the world. Armed with a lot of power on his side, he was able to fly, have supernatural strength, and being able to survive anything the world would throw at him. The Last Son himself was able to do a lot of impressive things, from being faster than any airplane and faster than a bullet, which at the time of World War I, using the fastest bullet measurements, he could have flown at speeds well over Mach 2.5. and was able to take multiple nuclear missiles and only losing an eye from it, meaning he had to have taken anywhere from around 100 to 300 kilotons of TNT at minimum, putting his durability at around the large town level ranges. And he could even amplify this by being able to grow in size, and theoretically way more. But unfortunately for the Last Son, he wouldn't be able to be the hero he wanted to be for long, because the US would replace his eye with one that was obtained by the one that was taken by the Lunarian Queen, and they would control him with this eye, practically becoming the god of the world, with America wanting to show the rest of the world that they were the superior ones and they had God by their side. However, once the Last Son regained his control, he ended up becoming so terrified of his actions he ended up hiding himself away, unable to live with his actions and becoming a house on the sea, with this house being absolutely massive, with estimates getting this house around 2,367 meters tall. In order to conjure up a structure to this magnitude, this means his output, when calculated, can reach anywhere from around 9 to 118 gigatons of TNT, with this being around the island to large island level ranges, and this is just a casual shape-shifting feat for him. But even with all of this power, he couldn't stop what was to come, because in truth, the Last Son was not a person. He was sent down there by the god Richard Nixon as part of an experiment to analyze humanity, and inevitably the Last Son couldn't control what was to happen next, with the Lunarian Queen setting her eyes on him and wanting him to become a part of her empire, and inevitably she turned him into the most threatening being through all of existence, the Crescent King. The Crescent King is certainly an odd being, but certainly one of the most powerful within the Monument Mythos series, with its power being compared to the Horned Serpent, with the Crescent King technically being a part of the Horned Serpent originally. And even this, he has been directly stated by Nixon himself that he is a threat beyond everything else in the series, and Nixon himself was afraid of what he could do. And this includes creatures like the reincarnated Horned Serpent, who was able to survive being stretched into the Wonderland, a dimension beyond ours where time and space don't matter, and Nixon considered the Crescent King as a bigger threat, one that could theoretically match him in some aspects, and destroy the Earth just like the previous destruction from the Horned Serpent, with the Crescent King's entire existence being almost impossible to comprehend, with him being able to possess anyone and take over their minds, with the Crescent King's existence being a literal constant as long as people continue to believe in his existence, which he can force them to know, he will always exist. And with this threat, Nixon had to stop all of this, and turned his entire world into fiction to make sure that the Crescent King's influence stayed fictional. But in the end, who really knows if this actually will contain the Crescent King forever? Potentially he could escape once people figure out it exists again in reality, if there is ever knowledge about him obtained once again. He truly was a god among men, one that didn't want to be one but ended up having to be one by force. But inevitably, this answers the question between our two combatants. Let's figure out who lives up to the title of God. Now that we've looked over both characters, let's see how they truly stack up in comparison to each other. But to get the obvious out of the way, Gabriel absolutely destroys the Last Son by himself. before he was the Crescent King, because Gabriel is just infinitely more powerful and exists on a completely different scale that the Last Son by himself cannot reach, and Gabriel just has way more hacks. So there isn't really much of a fight between these two, but the actual debate comes with the Crescent King. So let's see how these two are compared to each other, and we'll be covering who has what advantage. And to start off with intelligence, Gabriel is pretty easily smarter than the Last Son, at least provably. The Crescent King is definitely not dumb, since it knows how to control people and it knows how to use its powers in effective ways, but the problem is it is a creature made of completely grief. And Gabriel has just provably shown a lot more. Gabriel fooled his way up to the top, tricking Adam and Eve, fooling the shepherds, and replacing God without anyone realizing it for who knows how long. This being's entire character is how smart it is. It's not simply just a powerful deity that uses brute force. It knows what it's doing, and knows everything it has to do to get the way it wants, and is an all-knowing being with forbidden knowledge that no one has. It's pretty easily taking the advantage here. But not only is Gabriel smarter, but it's also provably more experienced than the Last Son is. Gabriel has existed for thousands of years provably, and most likely way longer than this. While the Crescent King has been around for a decent bit of time, it hasn't even been a century since it first became it. And while it should have a vast array amount of knowledge, it doesn't have that much in comparison, even when comparing it to the rebirth of the Horned Serpent, meaning that he probably has a decent bit of knowledge, but even then, Gabriel would still have the advantage, because of what he's done with his time in comparison. And now getting to where they kind of draw in some sense, although they both still have some things that they technically have the advantage over the other. In terms of speed, both of these characters should be roughly similar, because both of them can theoretically appear anywhere at any time, both having some type of omnipresence in a sense. Gabriel is technically less limited, since most of the time the Crescent King seems to need some sort of body to do this, but that's not really saying much since there is a lot of things that he can expose to its knowledge throughout the universe. And both of them technically exist on a higher plane of reality, and just appearing out of anywhere at any time means that they should relatively scale equally here. At least not to the point where either would have a distinct advantage that would matter in the fight. And when it comes to abilities, they also have pretty similar powers, with both of them being able to affect people's minds in a lot of ways, making them mad or even just killing them outright without even touching them. However, the Crescent King does have a decently better advantage. Not only is his mental manipulation way more absolute and way more effective than Gabriel, since he can outright possess people, and it works way faster as far as we know, but it also relates back to his ability to survive. Gabriel isn't anything awful because he does exist on two different planes, but the Crescent King theoretically not only does this as well, but he basically comes back based off of belief of his existence, which he can force onto others, meaning Gabriel would have to deal with not only knowing about the Crescent King, but he would also have to deal with that problem as well, that he is on a similar level to him already. Now, there are some questions that are kind of important to answer before we can come to a full result. First of all, can Gabriel inflict the Crescent King with MAD? And the short answer is no, and even if he could, it probably wouldn't do much. Admittedly, if he was just the Last Son, it probably would do something to some extent because he does have a human nature and probably wouldn't like what he's hearing from the forbidden knowledge. But when he's the Crescent King, not only is his human nature basically completely gone, meaning that MAD shouldn't really impact him all that much, but he also is just far more powerful than anything we've seen the extent of MAD being able to affect. And that's assuming he even listens to what Gabriel is saying in the first place. And even if for some reason he did end himself, it wouldn't really matter because the Crescent King can just come back. So overall, there's just too little for Gabriel to go off of here to make MAD really worth it using in this fight. The next question is, can Gabriel make an alternate of the Crescent King? And the answer is no. I'm gonna say this right now, this is not something he can do. Alternates, while are theoretically copies of another person, they are not perfect in any degree. Alternates are never the same exact power as they are when going against humans. Usually they are stronger because they are normal humans, but they're not perfect copies to any degree. And Gabriel is the only one that we've actually seen on a higher dimensional level. And if he was able to do this, he would probably make more than just himself. Assuming that he can just copy the abilities of the Crescent King into an alternate is just completely out of the range of what we know Gabriel can do. And the last question, does Gabriel's knowledge of the Crescent King make him a victim to the Crescent King just being able to form out of him and take him out that way? And the answer is complicated, but in my opinion, most likely not. Gabriel is very much a spiritual being, at least within our world, or at least a being that doesn't function under some human level of logic. You can definitely make arguments for the Crescent King being able to just kill Gabriel by forming out of him, at least from Gabriel knowing that knowledge. But I have some doubts because, especially since Nixon himself turning reality into fiction, even when he remembered the Crescent King himself, the Crescent King didn't just form out of him, so there's probably some type of extent that the Crescent King can fully form. Now, admittedly, Nixon did have to scrap his memory of the Crescent King in general, meaning that yes, there is some way the Crescent King can form from higher dimensional entities, but I'm not sure if Nixon himself would have died from the formation of the Crescent King. So while it is possible that Gabriel, even knowing about the Crescent King's existence, will just allow the Crescent King to form back, I'm not fully convinced that Gabriel would die as a process of this. Although again, you can argue either way. But let's get into the factor that really decides all of this: power. And this is where unfortunately Gabriel just doesn't have the means to keep up. As we said, Gabriel can scale to around 4th dimensional, theoretically based on the fact he can exist in 2 different planes of existence. And really pushing into the idea that he is as strong as God, meaning he would be relatively high in that level of power. But when scaling it to the Crescent King, there are some issues. As we stated, the Crescent King is also a being who should scale to higher dimensional things, since he can scale to the reincarnated Horrid Serpent, who can be stretched between dimensions, up to the world known as Wonderland, which exists outside our comprehension, meaning that he would be put at a very similar scale as Gabriel. However, the difference is when comparing how the Crescent King was actually viewed by Nixon, with Nixon claiming that a clash between him and the Crescent King would lead to the potential destruction of the Earth. Now, this might seem less impressive than a 4th dimensional being, which should be infinitely higher in scale to this, but the difference is the context behind it. Because Nixon was comparing this to the original Horned Serpent's awakening, which caused the Great Division, which basically fused the multiverse together, and even power beyond Wonderland theoretically. And even if it didn't destroy everything, it destroyed everything and fused it that mattered. Meaning that this Great Division can actually be scaled up from high 4th dimensional to 5th dimensional levels of power. Meaning he's matching or massively outdoing Gabriel in sheer power. Because at minimum they would be par on par with each other, but the Crescent King has better survivability and can always come back. Just outlast Gabriel in a physical confrontation, and at most the Crescent King is straight up taking him out with no issue at all, because he absolutely has so much more powerful than Gabriel that he shouldn't even be comparable to him. So in the end, Gabriel is ridiculously strong, but there's nothing he can really do here that can affect the battle in any way. His abilities aren't going to work, and his intelligence advantage isn't really going to help him much in a fight like this when he has no experience at all dealing with something this powerful. And if anything, if you believe that the idea that the Crescent King can just form out of Gabriel's mind from belief and kill him that way, the fact his higher intelligence and forbidden knowledge that Gabriel has, This would actually be more of a downside for him than anything, and would actively allow the Crescent King to casually eliminate Gabriel. But regardless if you believe it or not, unfortunately, Gabriel just wasn't prepared enough for a fight like this. He may have replaced God, but he can't replace something that is this absolute, because while Gabriel may have replaced his God, the Crescent King is the reincarnation of God, and in the end is just the more powerful force. The Crescent King wins.